when you start to learn about consent, it's really hard to just learn about consent because all of a sudden you have to look at all the ways that you've been socially coerced and how you've been brainwashed essentially by movies, TV, music, pop culture, magazines to like, this is how you're supposed to be, this is what you're supposed to want, this is how you're supposed to act, this is the kind of sex you should be having. A lot of people learn about consent and they think it's all about saying no. And I think for a lot of people, for a while at least, it really is because you realize you've never really said no in your life.
You were talking, I think, about just like the pendulum swings, I guess, that we go on
Oh, uh-huh.
with those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Are you able to, to speak to some of that?
Yeah.
Sorry, I lost my train of thought with that, but
Yeah. When you crack open this can of worms, as I said, like you pull the thread and you think you're just pulling it about this one thing, and then the whole thing unravels. Like when you start to learn about consent, it's really hard to just learn about consent because all of a sudden you have to look at all the ways that you've been, socially coerced and how you've been like brainwashed essentially by movies, TV, music, pop culture, magazines to like, this is how you're supposed to be, this is what you're supposed to want, this is how you're supposed to act, this is the kind of sex you should be having. And it's no wonder to me that a lot of people go like, you know, I just realized that I'm non-binary, and then they're like, and I'm also polyamorous, and I also am neurodivergent, and I'm also like, um, I'm queer, and I like all these things. Sort of the whole Jenga tower topples, um, and there's not really a way around that. I think. Which also becomes a really interesting question in like teaching consent like across cultures because there's like a lot of cultures where I think the way that I'm talking about these things like simply doesn't apply. Like I have a student right now who is from Egypt and like she talks about how women like legally don't have like the rights to their own bodies essentially. And so like the way that I'm like, and then you start questioning the gender binary. It's like that does not apply. Like that's not where we're going with this. So it's an interesting thing to just sort of see like cuz my work is global, that
Mhm.
like it's just people are having to really make it their own in ways that I would never expect.
Yeah.
Um Anyway, you brought up the pendulum. Yeah, a lot of people learn about consent and they think it's all about saying no. And I think for a lot of people, for a while at least, it really is because you realize you've never really said no in your life
Mhm.
and you've done so many things that you didn't want to do. Um, and so they get what I call no happy. They
Mhm.
just start saying no to everything. And, I think especially for people who've like reached burnout, that can be a really important phase for a while. But eventually you start to get a lot of FOMO, you miss your friends, people stop calling you,
Mhm.
you feel really isolated, really lonely. So the pendulum then tends to kind of like it has to kind of go back to the middle a little bit.
Mhm.
Um, but I wonder if you were also getting to the one about like this sort of realization that like everything is non-consensual and how I'm like very wary of people going down that road.
It wasn't that, but I do like that part of the conversation. I did realize what it was. What it was, and it might not have actually been the same article because I was like digesting a bunch of your stuff yesterday, so it's
Uh-huh.
probably just getting conflated. But it was the importance and like the distinction between like basically like consent as like a fact-based practice versus a feeling practice, and also just how important and how much more interesting and valuable feelings are. And you
Mm.
said something almost to the extent where it's like I'm interested in more in feelings over
Then
facts.
facts. Yeah.
Yeah, which is like kind of the opposite rhetoric that I don't really hear it as often as we used to, but there was like a strong component that originally I think started in the left that was like facts over feelings, and then the right side eventually took it and was like, oh, it's
Mm.
like facts over feelings, you soft snowflake kind of things, and that now it's become where like I actually really agree with you more and more. Like the more over the last I would say 8 years of my life, I've really worked to tune more and more and more into my own feeling state and like
Mm-hmm.
being aware and like that is what guides a lot of my thought process. And even like I remember being in an ethics class in college and like learning that like if your like feeling centers are disabled, you literally can't make a decision. I remember like
Mm-hmm.
this one story where this guy had his brain literally fucked up in that way, and he couldn't choose between like a red and blue pen because he had to like
Yeah.
figure out which one was the right one to do, and was just stuck. And it's like if people just realize how much of your decision making, regardless, is emotional,
Gut.
you're gonna
Yeah.
make faster decisions, which is usually a better thing.
Faster decisions.
Yeah, and you're gonna be able to like learn more and tap into those and trust your feelings to then create thought and communication versus
Yeah.
trying to think your way through everything.
100%. I mean, I think, the point that I made that you're referencing is like when I say I'm more interested in feelings than facts, it's because people are always going to argue about facts.
Hmm.
We don't share enough of, reality is subjective. Like, I'm going to say, you said this, and you're going to be like, no, I said it like this. And I'll be like, okay, well, it made me feel this. And the more important thing is like for us to tend to how we're both feeling
Hmm.
than like what was actually said. And I may be reacting to something that you think you didn't say, but what does it matter? Like, we're having these feelings now,
Hmm.
and that's what we have to address,
Hmm.
um, especially in terms of trying to maintain connection. Um, in terms of like, what's the question? Like consent. How does that relate to consent?
I think it was more just like wanting to explore that like idea and like kind of looping back around to this idea of like I would say facts over feelings. What is it that feelings can teach us that like
Mm-hmm.
facts can't, and why is that distinction important?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm also like I've been thinking about how to say this in a way that I like lately, which is that like my feelings are not always valid. Like people often say like your
Mm.
feelings are valid and I'm like they're not always valid. Like sometimes my feelings are insane. Sometimes my feelings like make no sense. Sometimes my feelings are happening because I'm triggered, which means that they have everything to do with something that happened a long time ago and nothing to do with what's happening right now.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that they're not real and something that we need to address. It also doesn't mean that they're like illegitimate. They're happening for a reason. They're
Right.
coming from a place. I'm not saying that they're wrong,
Right.
but it's not always, I think, like the most helpful thing to be like your feelings are valid because sometimes I'm like I'm freaking out. I'm having a meltdown right now. I don't think these feelings are really valid. I think we need
Mm.
to like regulate my nervous system. The feelings are bonkers.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think where I would push back slightly on the language is that, like, I still think even if they're completely crazy and irrational, they're still valid, right? It is what's happening, and I think like a lot of the struggle with our nervous system sometimes gets into a place where are not we don't want to feel these things. Like this shouldn't make any sense. I don't
Mm,
want to feel this way, and we start to resist that, right? And it's like
right.
it's often like just being even to able to acknowledge the fact that you're angry at yourself for being angry, and like if you can just like accept that part, then it starts to kind of unwind the whole
Yeah.
thing, right? But I also agree with you that I think sometimes that same phrase can be used as like an excuse for bad behavior or an excuse to
Yeah.
dominate somebody else because somebody's having an emotional experience,
Right.
and disregarding somebody else who's involved in the conversation.
Yeah. I mean, I truly think I've like definitely had the experience where I'm like, yeah, I'm having these feelings and I don't think they're even like your problem. Like I'm taking
Yeah.
them out on you. They're not your problem. And then had a partner say like your feelings are valid and I'm like, I don't know that they are. Like, I don't think so.
That's totally fair. Um, what's one of the biggest myths about consent?
Oh, that it's like a rule book and that it's very clinical and sterile and boring, robotic.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite statements you've said is like math, or it's not a math problem to be solved.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. You brought that up. Like I think what I said there was like it's not a formula to follow. It's not math with like a right or wrong answer. It's a lot more
Mhm.
like an English class or an art class where it's like
Yeah.
you're learning to interpret.
Hmm. Yeah. Beautiful.